So let's start off from where we finished on Tuesday. So on Tuesday, we finished the latter end of Colombo Stock Exchange, and we started looking at structured finance products, and we were able to even complete it. So what is a structured financial product? Structured financial product is where you bundle or pool a set of receivable and convert it into from a illiquid status to a liquid status. You know, receivables on a usual term, as a usual asset, is illiquid in nature. Yeah, the ability to realize or turn it into cash is very less. It takes a longer time and you have to incur an additional cost. So by converting such receivables into structured financial products, the company is able to free up the tied cash and use that cash into their investment purposes. That's the sole motive as to why structured financial products were brought about. So few of the famous or well-known structured financial products are the securitized or collateral financial products, such as asset-backed securities, mortgage-backed securities, and derivatives. So derivatives takes a separate chapter in our lesson. So throughout this entire session, we were discussing on just collateralized or securitized financial products. The main requirement came with the problem of mortgage loans, in other words, housing loans, the risks relating to that, and that paved the way to the securitized product segment. So, in the process of converting receivables into securitized financial product, you engage in a process called securitization. This is the heart of structured finance products. So what is this process? Remember, securitization is not the end product. It's just a process. So in this process, what do? You pool the illiquid asset class and convert them into a liquid or tradable asset-backed security. That is called securitization. So in securitization, we saw 4 steps. First, the company or the originator, the company which has that particular asset in their books, will recognize what asset class are they going to remove from their balance sheet. That's step number 1. After identifying that asset class, they will pool that asset class and transfer it to another entity called the Special Purpose Vehicle, SPV. Why do they do that? For legal and tax reasons, and also for a hope of better credit rating. Okay, so after transferring that to a special entity called the Special Purpose Vehicle, now the asset class belongs to the SPV. What does the SPV do? SPV will now use this asset which is in their book and issue securities backing this particular asset class. Those securities are the asset-backed securities or the structured finance products. So when these securities are issued to the investors will invest their money in the securities, which in turn will come to the SPV. Can the SPV hold the money for themselves? No, they owe the originator for the asset that they have taken over. So, in return to the asset they took over, they will give back the cash raised from this security issuance to the originator. So, the money will flow from the SPV to the originator. So, from the point of view of the originator got rid of the asset class and in turn got money back. That's how the entire securitization works. This is a diagrammatic overview, or the better one would be move for this. I don't think that's included in the slide. So this is how it moves. Then you pool the asset class, convert it into you use this asset class and issue a particular security backing this to the investor. When they pay back the money is flowed from the SPV to the originator. Now, when you pool the entire asset class and issue securities backing these asset class, you're issuing it's similar to debt security. You have to repay your investors back. Whenever there is a repayment involved, which indicates it's a debt obligation, there is always a requirement for a credit rating. Now, your asset class, which is the underlying asset for this security, that will determine the rating for the security. Why? Because this particular asset class, let's take this. So this particular asset class will decide the credit rating of the security. Now, let's say in this particular asset class, you get more than 50% of the book to be in overdue segment. Let's say 60% of this book is in overdue borrowings. Only about the balance 40 is in performing or is active on time payers. The entire portfolio would get a more speculative or closer to a speculative or a lesser investment grade rating. When you get such a rating, the entire security issuance will receive that. So when you approach your investors or reach your investors to market these securities, they will look at the rating and say, look here, no, very low, even as an investment grade, or look here, it's a speculative grade as a security. We cannot invest in such assets. Because most of the investors, they are usually, what's our rational thinking? Risk averse. They would want to take less risk. Risk takers are very few. So what happens? To address this issue, they started dividing the security that is being issued to the investor according to the backing asset. So they tranched the asset or broke down the asset class into the differing characteristics which affected their risk characteristics, and using that particular subclass, they started issuing securities. So if you, from this entire mortgage pool, you subdivide a portion of this loan book, which is on time payers. So those would be the less risky segment. So using them, you issue a security which would obviously get a better credit rating. Out of this asset class, you take a part of the loan book which are in overdue, that also, let's say, they belong to the more than 60 days and less than 90 loan book category. So they are like the highest risk segment. If you take them and issue a security backing such loan outstanding, obviously that security will get a very low credit rating due to the high risk. So this particular security, you would know, is much preferred by the risk takers. Why? Higher the risk, better the return. So you could target this security or market this security to such investors. So by tranching, what happens? This entire process is called tranching. You breaking down the portfolio into their classes, grouping the portfolio by various factors so that the differing credit risk is highlighted. By doing this, you get to achieve better credit rating for certain securities while the others don't, instead of the entire security getting a lesser credit rating. So to address this issue, tranching is used. Then we saw who are the market participants involved in securitization. The main participants in securitization is originator. Then of course you have the investor, and a person which we haven't mentioned here but discussed is the SPV. That's the third main participants. These three participants are the heart of the securitization process. All the others are ancillary service providers. So even in the ancillary service providers, we could classify them as to who they support. So an arranger would support the originator. Their motive is to help out or facilitate the needs of the originator. Servicer and asset manager are there to help out and offer their services to the SPV by looking after the asset class. The trustee and the financial guarantors are there to provide their services to the investor by overlooking the liability of the SPV, by looking at the security issued of the SPV. Credit rating agency monitors the entire arrangement and issues ratings, and thus they provide their service to the SPV, to the investor, to the entire setup as a whole. All right. Then looking at the end product, the end securitized debt instruments, we saw that we could divide them into mortgage-backed securities and asset-backed securities. What is the similarity and difference between these two? What is the similarity first? Both of them are end products of a process called securitization. Both of them are structured finance products where you pool an asset which is illiquid and convert it into a liquid and tradable asset. Both have a tranching structure. So when you issue the security, you will group them according to their differing risk characteristics. And both these securities are exposed to prepayment risk. If their underlying asset is being prepaid or realized before with cash, it reduces the underlying asset available. Okay, so these three are the main similarity. What is the key and only difference between these two asset classes? The only difference between these two is their underlying asset. If you take a mortgage-backed security, there the underlying asset is a mortgage loan or a housing loan. But if you take asset-backed security, there the underlying security is loans, any loans other than housing loans. It can be credit card, vehicle, student loan, any other loan other than the housing loan. That's the main and only difference between these two securities. Finally, we moved into structured financial product, a very important one. Part of derivative, which is credit derivative. Now here, what have they done? They are addressing a specific need of an investor. They're exposed to credit risk, and this derivative is there to address that issue. They are there to reduce the exposure to credit risk. Out of derivatives or credit derivatives, a very key or highly used credit derivative is the credit default swap. What is a credit default swap? We equated this to insurance. We saw that just like obtaining a vehicle insurance, here you would frequently pay your CDS premium. to a CDS seller. Why? In case of a credit event, in case of a default situation, you can obtain your recovery or your investment and accrued interest from the CDS seller and not from the company that you invested in, just as another party to repay your loss. This would be the arrangement. So when you obtain the CDS or credit derivative swap, credit default swap, you become the protection buyer or the CDS buyer. The person who sells it is the CDS seller or protection seller. So you transfer the credit risk that you are exposed to the protection seller. It doesn't get eliminated from this arrangement. It merely gets transferred to the protection seller or the CDS seller. And the entire arrangement, the compensation will work only on a default situation. If the reference entity defaults on the repayment of interest or repayment of principal amount to you, then you as a protection buyer, you as a CDS buyer could approach your protection seller for compensation. Now, just because this addresses and reduces the credit risk, it doesn't mean this entire setup is free of any other risk. No. Here, again, CDS buyer is exposed to something called counterparty risk, and CDS seller is exposed to something called jump to jump risk. First, we look at the CDS seller. What is this jump to jump risk? In case the reference entity defaults, this scenario, this situation, this jump will trigger protection seller to settle or compensate the protection buyer. So if this scenario jumps, if this scenario occurs, your risk will materialize. You will have to compensate to your buyer. That's what you mean by jump to jump risk. What is counterparty risk to the protection buyer? Let's say your protection seller has obtained or has given out CDS to all investors. And when this particular bond collapses, protection seller is bound to pay back to all the protection buyers. And if he cannot, and if he defaults, the protection buyer is not only just going to lose principal and interest, he will also lose the CDS premium that he had been paying. Now, if you didn't get a CDS, you will only use your principal and interest. But if you still get a CDS and yet your CDS seller also defaults on you, you're going to lose 3: interest, principal, and your CDS premium. For example, you insure your vehicle with an insurer. Your vehicle gets damaged, you approach your insurer for claim. If your insurer is also bankrupt, what's going to happen? Not only the vehicle damage is being unpaid, now the insurance premium that you paid is also lost. That's the main drawback of this setup. Another 2 credit derivatives that are available is total return swap and credit linked notes. Now, looking at these 2 credit derivatives, what you need to understand is what risk is being transferred to the other party. How is it different from CDS is going to be your main attention. In total return swap, what you do is you try to get a clarity on your return. You expect that your return from a particular asset could decline, could fluctuate. Now, if it's going to fluctuate favorably, will you try to get this? No. You expect it to be an unfavorable fluctuation. Hence, what you do, you swap. What do you mean by you swap? You exchange. You will receive the total return from that particular asset, and you will exchange that return to the protection seller. Protection seller, on the other hand, agrees to make a particular return payment to you. Now, this is usually fixed in nature, so irrespective of market fluctuations, you get a return. Sometimes it could be variable as well with a specified spread. So if the referent asset goes bankrupt, still you're protected. Why? The protection seller is bound to pay your return. Now, in this entire arrangement, not only default risk is being covered or is being transferred to the protection seller, even credit deterioration risk and market risk is being transferred from protection buyer to protection seller. Credit linked notes. Now, this is a very different credit derivative. Why? You call this a funded credit derivative. Here, even before a credit event occurs or credit event triggers, you receive the entire investment amount that you put on a security through this credit derivative. So what happens? You have a particular asset. You have a particular asset that you have invested in. You put your money to that and you receive the asset. But now you feel that something could go wrong with this asset. Hence, you use this asset as the underlying asset and issue securities. Now, sometimes you can get an underwriter involved here as well. If not, you yourself will issue securities. This security is called credit linked note to credit linked buyers. And these investors, these buyers, will pay money to you upfront. So when you sell this security, you will receive your money. Still, nothing has gone wrong with the underlying asset, but you have received the entire investment money back through the CLN. Through the CLN. What happens whenever the underlying asset gives you return? You will pay back your CLN buyers using that particular return. On a situation where there is a credit downgrade or in a situation where there is a default, the return that you pay to the CLN will reduce. Why? Now the risk has materialized. So you have to pass that risk. You are not the one who's bearing that risk. Because it's a credit linked note, that reduction in return, the default risk is now passed to the CLN. If there is no such risk being materialized, at the time of issuance especially, you will offer a better rate to your CLN buyers due to the additional risks that they take up. So in this arrangement, you transfer default risk and credit deterioration risk to the CLN buyer along with counterparty risk and possible reduction in yields as well. Okay, these are the risks that you will pass to your CLN buyer. You as a CLN issuer or a protection buyer is now not exposed to counterparty risk, which was there in CDS. So understand the differences and similarity as well. What's the similarity? Both the credit derivatives, both are credit derivatives and they cover credit risk. What are the differences? You as a protection buyer is not exposed to counterparty risk. You as a protection seller receives your money upfront. In other words, this is a funded credit derivative. This is the summary of what we studied on Saturday. And with that, we move to the current lesson that we were going through, which is derivatives. So, derivatives, I told you, is another asset class which falls under structured financial products. Why structured financial products came about, I informed you prior as well. They have a particular innovative needs. Now, over time, the financial products that you get are very different. Cater to the differing return requirements of the return and risk investors. So, derivatives as a financial was first introduced to eliminate or minimize the investor or a particular company's risk exposure. That was what a derivative instrument was. Derivative stands out from other products. Why? It is always backing an underlying instrument, underlying asset. That's how structured financial products stand out from the rest of them. If you take mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed security, that particular security has an underlying asset which is backing that security. The similar setup is available in derivatives. Now here, your underlying asset or the possible risk is going to come from the underlying asset. So to cover that risk is why you include that and build a derivative. So derivative can be used for three purposes. We studied it on Tuesday: hedging, speculation, and arbitrage. Hedging is the primary purpose as to why you use derivative, to overcome or to reduce your risk exposure. It's for the hedging purpose that derivatives were started to be used. But over time, there was a situation where it gave massive gains to certain companies. And then they understood, look here, derivatives we could even use as a investment, as a speculation tool as well. And then after that on, you had certain investors investing in derivatives, using derivatives to gain an additional return. There are certain investors, or you could call them mainly traders, who use derivatives by capitalizing the arbitrage opportunity. So when there are two derivative markets where a commodity or the underlying asset is being traded in one market at a lesser price than the other, they could capitalize or use this derivative for their arbitrage purposes. What are the four main derivative types? Forward contracts, futures contracts, option contracts, and swap contracts. In local context, the mostly used derivative is forward contracts. What is forward contracts? This is obviously a derivative. This derivative is customized and is legally binding. Those two are the main key terms which will define this contract. Here, you make a commitment, you make a contract on day one. You do not execute a transaction on day one. You merely enter into a contract. Now, this contract that you enter into is legally binding. You cannot back off. either party is obligated to perform this contract. Next, that particular contract that you enter is a customized contract. The contract that is designed for you cannot be passed to another person. Hence, all the more requirement for you to, or you're obligated to execute this contract on the date. So why do you have this contract? It can be a commitment to buy that underlying asset or sell the underlying asset at a future date at a specified or decided price. Now, when it's a forward contract, that particular decided price, you call it the forward price or the forward interest rate or the forward exchange rate, depending on the underlying asset. Now, what's important in a forward contract is, when you study the other derivatives also, you will find this. The speciality here is on the day one that you make the arrangement with your seller of the forward contract, you do not have to pay anything. On the deal date, on the contract date, you have no any payment. It is on the maturity or at the future specified date on which you are obligated to execute this particular contract. It's on that date that you have to make your payment and any additional fees. Now, because this is a customized product, can you trade it in an exchange market? What is designed for me will not be designed for you. Correct? Hence, you can't trade it in an exchange. These are traded in over-the-counter market. So you approach the bank, deal with their particular dealer, you talk to them, you convey your requirement. You might need so and so amount of dollars, while the other person would need much higher amount of dollars. The period that you want would be maybe just 1 month, but the other party would want for maybe 1 year or more. Okay, so depending on the customization and the request, it has to be changed. Hence, forward contracts are traded in over-the-counter market, and the underlying asset, usually on majority of the time, is exchange rate. Here, the seller of the contract is usually in a short position, while the buyer of the contract is in a long position. So buyer of the contract usually makes an agreement to buy the particular underlying asset from the seller of the contract. So ultimately, the buyer is in long position and seller is in the short position. We saw the disadvantages that come about. I don't have the note with me at the moment. So anyway, so on your note, I have disclosed the advantages and disadvantages of forward contracts. Look at that as well, because most of the time they try to compare this with other derivatives, especially with futures. This is where we stopped last week when we started going through futures. So what is futures contract? Futures is very different from forwards. The basic arrangement is same, where you enter into a contract to sell or buy an underlying asset at a future date and at a decided price. But this particular contract is not customized. It's a standardized contract. Because it is standardized, it's not tailor-made to a person's requirement. Of course, anyone could purchase it. Now, for example, you go to a particular clothing store, look at the dresses available, and you buy the dress that you need. That option is available for you and available for me. We all approach that one particular location, that one centralized place, and get it done. But If you want something customized, you approach your tailor, you talk to the person, your entire measurement, design, everything has to be spoken about. And what's designed for you cannot be given to somebody else. So, futures here is a standardized contract. It's already decided, or the rules are already decided. Depend you as a customer, you as a party to the contract, you have to adjust your requirement according to what's available. But forward contracts is not like that. Your requirement, your need is the key. Here, because it is standardized, even though you have a commitment that you have to honor, you can of course trade it in the market. Hence, you have a way to get out. This, because of its standardized nature, is traded in organized exchange, not over the counter market. All right. Here in futures, just like shares, think about shares every day. It's a exchange market just like shares. So every day the price of the futures will fluctuate. If you have bought your futures, you will have to mark to market your investment every day to realize whether it's a gain or loss and adjust it accordingly. All right. That's another differentiating factor. For forward, we didn't have something like that. Here, daily you will realize whether it's a gain or a loss. In futures, another differentiating requirement when you compare, especially with forwards, is the margin requirement. When you approach the futures market to buy futures, there is a commitment to place a margin. Now, we didn't have that in forward market. That's why I told you the day one that you come in, you don't have any cash outflow. But here on the day one you come in, you have a margin requirement to place funds. What is this margin requirement? You have this margin requirement to ensure, to make sure that either party will fulfill their commitment. To ensure that you have a particular amount placed as a deposit. You don't have the entire amount itself, just a part of it. So the very first deposit that you make, the very first margin that you make is called the initial margin. Then you have something called maintenance margin. This is the minimum margin that you have to place in that particular, for that position, for that contract that you purchased. Then you have something called variance margin. In case you breach or your balance initial margin goes below maintenance margin, you will have to bring in additional funds. That additional funds is called variation margin. Now I'm going to explain this margin setup to you with this particular diagram. Okay. So think about this. First, let's think about a bank account, which is very much easier for you. Now, let's say you have a corporate customer who's coming to open a current account with you. Okay. So when they come to open a current account, of course, you will tell them, okay, this is this is your new current account. The first deposit that you make, the initial deposit, is 100,000. And you also inform them, look here, as per bank policy, the minimum balance is 25,000. So now your new customer who opened the new current account will place 100,000 with you as the initial margin. Thereafter, of course, he will do transactions. And let's say one day the account balance falls to 20,000, below the minimum balance. Now, if you have a good relationship with the corporate, you will inform the company, look here, your current account balance has fallen below the minimum margin. You are subject to penalty fees, the minimum balance fees. So why don't you bring in additional funds to top up? Okay. Then he will bring the additional funds to top up. The similar setup happens in the futures market. Here also, when you are going to enter into a contract, that particular contract will stipulate your initial margin. So you put that particular amount in the margin account. Now remember, day to day, every day, you are going to market with the fluctuating market prices. So when you keep adjusting your position to the daily gains and the daily losses, your initial margin, when there are consecutive losses, is going to come down. When there are consecutive gains, obviously it will get built up. Now, the market, futures market, is all the more okay, they're okay to accommodate a reduction in initial margin. They know the losses will reduce the initial margin. They're okay for that. Now, when this keeps reducing, let's say it meets the maintenance margin as well. Maintenance margin is 25,000. Now, your initial margin has come down to 25,000 as well. Still, position is okay. Why? You're exactly at maintenance margin. Let's say it goes below 24,000. You get a margin call, a notification from the market saying, look here, your balance is below the maintenance margin, please top up. Now, this is where the bank account and the futures market will differentiate. Why? Now, in the bank account, when you ask your customer to top up, they can just top up to the minimum balance and keep. They don't have to bring all the way to the initial margin. But here, when you top up, you tell the person, look here, not only up to maintenance margin, you top up back until initial margin. Get it? So variation margin is the additional amount that you bring in when you get a margin call, and you have to meet up to the maintenance margin. So in this particular diagram, this entire change, let's say balance has reduced up till here. So this entire change is called variation margin. You can have losses which will lead the initial margin to reduce. They are okay with that. But moment it goes below maintenance margin, you receive margin call. And that margin call tells you, look here, you have gone below maintenance margin, please top up. And you have to top up until initial margin. And this topped up amount is called the variation margin. I hope I was very clear. Okay. So now we are going to see how is this loss being reported. Why is this loss being reported? Let's see how this mark to market works. Now this is our example. So in this example, 24th of September last year, futures to buy cotton was priced at $90.75. So you as a buyer have purchased for 90.75. Myself as a seller, I have sold it at 90.75. Okay, no problem. Initial day that you entered into the future, good. Next day. Now the next day in the market, this particular futures is being priced at, or with this future with the same similarities of same details, is being priced at 93.75. Price has increased by $3. Now when the price has increased, who has benefited yesterday, or who has benefited on the 24th of September? The buyer has benefited. Why? He was able to buy a futures which was today 93 but yesterday 90. Okay, so they were able to buy the future at a lesser price, which indicates that the buyer, y'all, are at a gaining position. Myself as a seller, what happens? I am at a loss situation. Why? This particular futures is now being traded at 93. Yesterday I sold it for a lesser price. So today I could have sold it for $3 higher. So as a seller, $3 is lost. The buyer receives the gain of $3. So in the account of the seller, $3 will be deducted, and in the buyer's account, $3 will be added. Now the very next day, 26th September. Now 26th September, you realize price has further come down to 90.25. Now, two things you have to decide. What are the two things? First, you have to decide who is receiving the benefit and how much is that benefit or the loss. Now, first, who is receiving the benefit? Price is 90.25. Okay, but the person who bought it at 90.75. There is a 50 penny reduction. The price has come down. Buyer has bought it at a higher price. So buyer is at a loss, seller is at a profit. Why? Seller is now has been able to sell at 50 penny higher. So seller is at a benefit, buyer is at a loss. Now how much is this profit? How much is this loss? Can I compare 90.25 with 90.75? No. I can't compare this with this to calculate how much is my gain. Why can't I do that? Because yesterday on the 25th of September, you have already adjusted your accounts to 93.75. So today on the 26th of September, if you are going to identify your gain or loss, you are going to match it with the price that was there yesterday. So 93.75 with 90.25, you understand there is a $3.5 difference. Price which was higher yesterday has now come down so low. So the person who's facing the disadvantage, the buyer will face the loss of $3.5, whereas seller will get the benefit of the $3.5. Remember, when you calculate the gain on future, you compare it with the previous day. When you calculate the gain in amount, why? Every day you are marking your position to the market price. So on the 25th, he has adjusted his position, gain or loss, according to that particular day's price. So today when you are trying to do that, you have to compare with yesterday's price. But to note or to understand who got the profit, who got the loss, you will compare your today's price with the day that you purchase the future. So how it would work is, so let's say buyer and seller, both of them have an initial margin of $10. So on the day 1, 25th of September, buyer receives $3. So he becomes the team. This one loses $3, so he will be at 7. Next day, there is a loss to the buyer, 3.5 is lost. So they are back at 9.5. Here, they get a benefit of 3.5, hence 10.5. Now, in this arrangement, let's say your maintenance margin is 8. Let's say maintenance is 8. When you pass this particular transaction, this is okay. But can you see here? You had a problem. So the seller would receive a margin call saying, look here, your balance has reached really below the maintenance margin. So top up to 10. So he might bring the additional loan money, top it up by $3, which will bring it back to 10. So on the 26th, when they do the trade again, when they do this mark to market again of 3.5, the seller will be at a better position or 13.5, while the buyer is at 9.8. So this how the day-to-day marking happens, and the losses are reported in the margin account. Thirdly, we have a derivative called options. Now this option is a very different derivative. In the first two derivatives, there was an obligation for you to commit. Forward especially, you couldn't back out. Futures, because it was standardized, you had the ability to trade in the market. Option is all the more difference. Here, you are not obligated at all. What you as a buyer of an option is entitled is the right to execute. If he wants, if he feels the derivative is profitable, he could execute or he can omit it. So in a future uncertain period, obtaining option is recommended. Why? Depending how the environment will roll out, they could decide whether to execute the derivative or not. They are not fully committed or they are not compelled to execute if the future situation is unhealthy or not in favorable position. Okay. So in options, what's the tricky part here is, in a forward, both parties were obligated. Buyer was obligated and seller was obligated. In option, seller is obligated as always. Buyer of an option has the right. The option, as the name says, provides the person who holds that option the opportunity or the ability to make a choice. They have the option to execute or to back out. Now, let's take the example that we were going through. a exporter gets into a forward contract. So this is the market price that we are going to talk about. So market price on the day this is day 1. This is, let's say, day 30. On day 1, the market gave an exchange rate of 1 USD equals 203, let's assume. You expect in 1 month's time this to come down further. Let's say you know that they are getting funding lines and so forth. Hence, you're scared that $1 will be equal to 150. Now, who are you? You are an exporter. For you, higher the exchange rate, better it is. Now, because you foresee such an event where in the future, in 1 month's time, exchange rate is going to come down to 150. And in 1 month's time, you are expecting 1 million US dollars. So if that 1 million US dollar came today, you will be having 200 million LKR. But if it come, because it's coming at the end of the month, you are now going to lose 50 million rupees. So looking at this particular setup, you obtain a forward contract. You're scared that this will happen. So you obtain a forward contract with the bank where the bank will say, look here, we can only offer you 1 USD we can offer 1 USD at 160 rupees. Okay, so you in 1 month's time you're able to sell your dollars to the bank at 160 per dollar and earn 160 million in rupees. So this will be your forward contract. Now what happens on that particular day? On that particular day, the real market price ends up being 250. So in 1 month's time, the exchange rate has now appreciated dollar for rupees 250. Okay, is at 250. Can the exporter back out? Can't, because it's a forward. You are obligated. So even though the situation is very favorable to you, now if you didn't get this derivative, you could have obtained 250 million LKR for your 1 million USD. But now you are going to get only 160 million. All right, you are losing 90 million in rupee terms due to this forward. So even though market is favorable, you have to forget what the market has indicated. You have to go ahead with the forward. But if this entire arrangement is an option, exporter has the discretion, has the ability to decide whether to go for 160 or whether to go for 250. So hands down, he will say, no, I'm not executing the option. I will rather go ahead with the market given rate. So option gives you this backup, saying, look here, if something bad happens, I'm there to minimize the risk. But if something good happens, don't worry, I'm not going to limit it. A forward will limit the good, but option gives you, because you are the buyer, it gives you the discretion where you can have a better gain by going into the market. That's how the option will work in comparison to a forward. Option is a contract that gives the holder, so who is the holder? The person who buys the option, the right but not the obligation to buy or sell an underlying asset at a specified price. Now, this specified price is called the strike price or the exercise price within or at a specified period of time. Now, in this entire definition, there are a lot of keywords for you. Let's break down the keywords and get a good understanding. Now, in this definition, it says who gives the holder the right. We know, yes, okay, because it's option, it gives you the right but not the obligation. Now, understand this particular right goes to the option buyer, the holder. It doesn't come to the option seller. Now think about this scenario that we were discussing. Now in this setup, because the option is giving you 160, market is giving you 250, you as an exporter can drop the strike price of 160 and go ahead with the market. Okay. But think about the other person, the person who's going to offer you 160. You as an exporter have 1 million USD, there's another party with rupees to pay for your dollars. Now that party only has quoted 160. In this setup, he has the ability to buy 1 million US dollars for 160 each, whereas outside $1 is worth 250. So he can buy something at a lesser price. So obviously the person who's selling you this particular option is very keen for you to exercise this. Okay. So if you give the seller also the option, or seller is also given the right to execute, it will be problematic. Why? Obviously exporter will exercise when it's favorable for him, or the buyer will exercise it when it's favorable for him, and the seller will exercise it when it's favorable for him. So both their interests will start to clash. So in a way to avoid it, what they do? In an option, the right to execute is only given to the option buyer. Option seller doesn't have such a right. He is obligated because he sold a product. Whatever the customer says or whatever the buyer says, he has to do. He doesn't have a discretion there. That is number one. Second, the option that you buy can give you the right to buy that underlying asset or to sell that underlying asset. Now remember how derivatives work. This is your derivative. Your derivative has a underlying asset. Now this underlying asset in our previous example was a exchange rate. Now it can be a share as well, it can be interest rate as well, so forth. Now because this is a derivative, which is getting its value from this underlying asset. Okay. Now in this option can give you the right to buy this underlying asset or to sell that underlying asset to the counterparty. So depending on whether it's a buying right or a selling right, options can be divided. Next, the specified price. It's a future price that you're going to quote. So in a forward, we saw that it's a forward price. In future, we saw that it's a futures price. In options, you call that the strike price or the exercise price. It's the price at which you're going to execute your particular option. Next, within or at a specified period. Now, this also classifies or groups the option into two. Whether that option gives you time to execute over a period or on a particular date will decide what type of option is what you have purchased. Now, there are some options which will give you 3 months time to execute. So any day in the 3 months you can use. There are some options which will give you only one day. It will say on the 20th of October you can purchase this at this price. So only on 20th October you could do it. So let's say on that day there is a market crash and all the prices have gone down. Obviously you won't execute your buy option or your option to buy the underlying asset. So this particular definition is very, very important and it covers all aspects of the option as well. Option buyer or contract purchaser doesn't have to exercise the option. If the option is favorable to them, of course, he can buy and sell the underlying asset. If it's unfavorable, he could simply omit or disregard the option without exercising. The contract seller, on the other hand, or the option seller, on the other hand, is obligated. He is obligated to honor the decision of the option buyer. If the option buyer says buy, he has to sell from his end. If the option buyer decides to sell, he is obligated to buy from his point. Okay, so contract seller has no flexibility or no room to get out if the counterparty honors. Option premium is the commission or cost paid to the writer of the option to purchase the option from the to purchase the option by the option buyer. Now this is a very, very important one. Option premium. In forwards, did we have to pay any particular amount on the day we deal? No. But in futures, there was a margin requirement. In options, what happens? In options also, you have a commission or a option premium. You have to pay that premium to the seller of the option. Why? For the seller of the option, that's the only income. So to compensate possibility of a future loss, he has to now give or compensate the option seller with the option premium. So depending on the definition for options, we can divide options into several categories. So depending on whether the underlying asset can be bought or sold, it can be divided as call option and put option. Depending on the maturity time or the time given for the deal to get executed, you can classify option as American option and European option. And depending on the lucrativeness of the option, you can classify options as in the money, out of the money, or even at the money. Now we are going to see all of these classifications in detail. Now in this setup, Where was that earlier one that we drew? Okay. So let's say in this setup, you have a option. This is a option. So what is this option giving you? This option is having an underlying asset. Let's say the underlying asset is X company shares. What is the right that the holder will get, or what is this option trying to give? Option gives you the right to buy X company shares, or let's say 10,000 X company shares at 100 rupee each. So if this option is bought by, let's say, one of you now this option, let's say it's a 1 month option, so you will hold this option for 1 month, and on the, let's say, on that particular day only you would exercise. So on the very last day of the month, you will see the market, and you see X company shares is being trading at 200 rupees. Here, because you have an option, you have the opportunity to buy it at 100 each. Now, what is the opportunity given to you? To buy that underlying asset. Because it's giving the right to buy, it provides or it categorizes into call option. So, call option gives the option buyer the right to buy the underlying asset. What does the put option give you? Just the opposite. Here, again, option buyer has the right to sell the underlying asset at the specified price and at the given date. Here, let's say now you exercise this, now you have X company shares. After a month, you approach where you think this company is going to face future losses, hence now you want to get out of the company. So you can devise an option to sell. Sell 10,000 X company shares at 250, or let's say 280. X company shares can be sold for 280. Now, when you buy this option, it gives you the right to sell the X company shares. So, ideally, you should be having X company shares. Okay. So, when you buy this, it will give you the right to get rid of your portfolio at 280. Then, because it gives you the right to sell something, you're not buying here, it becomes a put option. Now, how do you remember this, whether it's call or put? When you call somebody in, when you call someone in, what do you mean by that? You bring them on board. So obviously when you purchase a new asset, it would fall under call option. Put option is when you're trying to get out, when you sell. So put option refers the ability of the option buyer. Option doesn't get the rights. Option buyer gets the right to sell the underlying asset. Next type of categorization which is available is depending on when option can be exercised. Now, in an American option, America and Europe, the culture is very, very different. In America, it's more of a free, or you can call it the democratic country where you have a lot of freedom to execute. US, not so much. There is a broader guideline that you follow. So in the American option, what they try to tell you is American option gives you the opportunity or gives you a elongated period to exercise your option. Now let's say this particular setup. Now this is for 1 month in our example. Now you don't have to wait till the end of the month to sell X company shares at 280. Within the month, if it's American option, within that 1 month, let's say on a date, selling price of X company is going very low, then you can exercise this option and of course get a better return. Even though the price are declining, now you have the ability to sell at a better price. So this will fall as the American option. What do you call the European option? Here there is no any elongated dates for decision. Here you are bound to make your contract or do your deal on that particular desired maturity date. It's only on that day that you can execute. All other days, even though it's favorable to you, you as option buyer has no ability to execute it. Why? It's a European option. American option is an option which can be exercised at any time between the time of writing and the maturity date. So if you draw up a diagram for this, so let's say this is the deal date and this is the contract date. So in an American option, what happens? The day you bought the option until the day you execute it, any day, you can choose any day to execute. But if it's a European option, oh no, no, no. Whatever happens, only this last particular date is an option which can be exercised only on its expiration, not before. So the time period given to exercise the option is also important. If it's a longer period, obviously the buyer is at a benefit, right? For a longer period, he could see the market every day, make a very good conclusion and get a better return, while others can't. Finally, the lucrativeness of the option, whether the option is in the money, out of the money, or at the money. Now here, in the money means you are at a lucrative position. You are at a better position where you are getting more money. Out of the money infers to you being obviously out of money, cashless. So out of the money will denote a situation where option doesn't give you a better return. At the money, now even though I haven't mentioned it here, I am telling it you verbally. There is another type where you call it at the money. What does at the money mean? It's a no profit, no loss situation. You're exactly at the break even point. Now look at this particular diagram. Now, whether your option is a lucrative option, whether the option is a loss making option, the way you're going to view it will be different based on whether it's going to give you the right to buy or right to sell. Now, obviously, if it's giving you a right to buy, you expect your option to give you the lowest price possible. Why? You're trying to buy something, so you want to buy something low. If your option is giving you the right to sell, you expect the option to give you the best and the highest price possible. Okay. So having that in mind, look at this diagram. A particular share price is being traded in the market for 6 rupees and 27 cents. Okay. This is the current market price. Now you have an option which is a call option. What do you mean by call option? You have the ability to buy this share. So in this call option, your strike price or exercise price is 6 rupees per share. Currently at the market, share is being traded at 6 rupees and 27 cents. Now you have the ability to buy it at 6 rupee per share. Is it a benefit or is it a loss? Even though it's very less or very minimal, it's still a benefit. So you call that in the money call option. Again, similar example, but now you hold a call option which gives you the ability to buy this share at 7 rupees. But currently in the market, the share is being traded at 6 rupees and 27 cents. What will happen? When you come home, obviously they will ask you, why did you pay 7 rupees for 6 rupee and 27 cents worth share? You could have rather bought it in the market. Correct? So if the strike price is higher, they are not going to execute the agreement. So it will be out of money. Go through put option. Again here, a particular share has a market price of 6.27 rupees. Now here your view is higher the strike price, better it is. Why? You are struggling to get rid of something or want to get out of something, you want to sell something. So you will look at the highest price possible. So a particular share, the market price is 6 rupees and 27 cents. Let's say that particular share's strike price is $6 per share. In the market, it's being sold for 6 rupees and 27 cents. But now you have the ability to sell it at 6 rupees per share. You are now having a loss. Why? In the market, you could have sold it for 6.27. Now you're selling for 6 rupees. So that particular point where the strike price is lesser than the market price, in a put option, it will be out of money. But think about the opposite. If you bring in or if you have the option to sell and the strike price is higher, around 7 per share, but current market price is only 6 rupees and 27 cents. Now, due to this option, you have the capability or the ability to sell at a much higher price. So, obviously, if it's a put option where the exercise price is higher than the market price, it will be in the money. Now, in this diagram, you could see in the money. In the money is decided, of course, by comparing the strike price and the ongoing stock market price, but you will also include whether the option is call or put. That is going to affect your entire calculation. Understand what is in the money, what is out of the money, and the situations in which this could happen. Now what we are going to look at is profit and loss, or profit or loss from options. Now we could see when the market price is moving, of course your loss or your profit will also move every day. So how can you plot this in a diagram? The diagram is called the payoff diagram. Why? They are going to plot on how, when the option will be profitable and when the option would be disadvantageous. Now when you look at this particular slide, of course in your note I have given you the details example, so go through that as well. Here I have just included you the final diagram. Here, depending on whether it's a call option or a put option, the gain will differ, and based on whether you're the buyer of the option or seller of the option will also decide your profit and gain. Now first let's go to the easiest one, call option. If you are a person who's buying such a call option, okay, that's what this diagram is telling you. Now in this particular diagram you could see it's not getting pasted, so let's go ahead with this. Here can you see the stock price at expiration? So this decides the market price. So if the market price is less than 8.8, it's going to be at a loss segment. But if the option is giving you a price, or if the market price is increasing, sorry, if the market price is increasing in comparison to the option given price, your gain is going to increase. Look here, let's say in this entire arrangement, your price, the price that you expected, or the option given is 7.5. Okay, 7.5 is the university given, sorry, it's the, in this particular share, that is your strike price. Let's say the market price is now increasing to 9.8. You have the ability to buy it at 7.5. Are you at a gain or loss? In the market, this particular share is worth 9 rupees. Because of this option, you can buy it at 7.5. Obviously, at the market price of 9.8. Now remember, this line is telling you the market price. Here, this will give you a profit. Let's say the market price is also 7.5. Strike price is also 7.5. Market price is also 7.5. Will it be a gain or a loss? You will be wondering, no, it's a no gain, no profit situation. But no. Why? I would say it's a loss situation. Yes, strike price is 7.5 and even the market price is 7.5. Does it make a difference whether you buy from the market or You buy from the option. But to buy this option, you paid a price. What is that price called? It's called option premium. That option premium is now going to be a loss. That's why in this diagram, even though strike price is equal to the market price, still a loss is reported. Why? Your premium is going to be your entire loss. Let's say the market price is slowly increasing. This will decrease your loss until your premium paid is covered as well. Then from that point onwards, it's a profitable scenario. That's why here, can you see, at selling price of 9.8, your profit is only 1. Why? Market price is 9.8. Your strike price is 7.5. You bought this for 1.3. That is your option premium. This is your option exercise price. So your ultimate gain is just 1, which is shown as here. So when you decide whether it's a loss, whether it's a profit, you are not only going to compare the strike price and the market price. You will compare the additional cost, which is your option premium as well. So this tells you, this particular diagram tells you, if you are a person who bought a option and that particular option is a call option. Remember, you can buy any option, but that particular option can be a call or a put. Here, you bought an option and that option is a call option, giving you the right to buy that underlying asset. Then, when the market is increasing or when the market price is increasing, your profit is unlimited. Your profit can increase drastically. But if you are a buyer of an option, which is a call option, and the price of the underlying asset is declining, then your loss is at maximum or is limited to the option premium. Why? Even though share price is declining, you are not obligated to sell it. Sorry, you are not obligated to buy from the option. You could, of course, drop the option and buy from the market. So if you drop the option, what is your cost? The premium that you paid. So here, to a buyer, the loss is limited to the premium. Now, can you see that on the put option as well? In the put option, a buyer who bought an option which gives the right to buy, to sell that underlying asset. If that underlying asset's market price is increasing daily, then of course you are at a loss. Why? You could rather sell it at the market price. But your loss is limited again here to the premium. Why? You as a buyer have the option, but your profit is again unlimited. Why? If the share price is declining or if the price of the underlying asset is declining, you can sell at a much higher price, giving you a increasing or a much wider profitability. But think about the seller of an option. If I'm selling you the option, buy or call for that matter, what is my return? My only return is the premium, the fee that you pay me. Okay, that's going to be my return. So to the seller, whether it's a call option or put option, I hope you could see this diagram clearly, their profit is limited. Their profit is limited to the call premium, but their loss is unlimited. Why? If the price keeps increasing in a call option, or if the price keeps decreasing in a put option, they are at a much bigger loss. Okay, I hope you understand. Now here, if the price keeps increasing, now it's a call option. Call option meaning, now you, let's say you are the buyer of this option, you have bought this derivative. This derivative is giving you the right to buy a company's shares for 10 rupees. The price of this share is increasing 20 rupees, 30 rupees every day. I am the seller of the derivative. By selling you this derivative, I am agreeing to sell that underlying asset at 10 rupees to you. You are buying it at 10. In the market, I could have sold it for 30, 20 rupees. It's increasing rapidly. So if the share price is increasing, or if the underlying price is increasing in the market, in a call option, buyer is profiting, seller is losing. In a put option, you have a derivative call option, you have bought that option. This derivative is giving you the right to sell that underlying asset to me, the seller of the option. I have to buy it from you. Okay, let's say that price is 100 rupees and this particular asset's market price is declining 2010, but you are at a profitable situation. Why? You can sell it at 100 while the market price is declining. I am the seller of this derivative who is now obligated to buy this asset from you. I have to buy at a higher price while the market price is declining. So obviously seller loses and the buyer profits. What I need you to understand here is, for the buyer, in both option, loss is limited, profit is unlimited. To a seller, profit is limited and loss is unlimited. Another point I want you to highlight is, I have defined the seller as a writer as well, because in certain text, sometimes in certain textbooks, they have defined the seller of an option as a writer of the option as well. If you see the word a person written an option, meaning the person is selling that option. Or if you have written an option, that means you have sold the option. Okay, so it's to a seller, or the process of selling is referred as writing or writer. So I have put a stroke and marked that as well, so you all don't get confused. Okay, writer meaning that's the person who's creating this option for you, hence the seller. All right, I want you to remember as to the profits made by the buyer being unlimited, loss being limited, for the seller, profit being limited and loss being unlimited. And remember how the curve moves. Can you see the profit and loss curve for a buyer in a call option is the mirror image of a put option scenario. It's just the opposites. Same thing for a seller. And even if you compare these two, these are mirror images. So understand how this diagram works. At your exam, sometimes, now this particular diagram, if you think correctly, you could even rationally argue and draw at the exam. But if you remember certain key points, irrespective of the option, buyer's loss is limited, profit is unlimited. then the graph has to be such a way that below has to be a straight line and thereafter a direct line going on. Now your call is whether where the curve would start. That's going to be your only thinking point. So understand the rationale correctly, then drawing up this diagram won't be such a difficult. Now you can see, now if you see this, you will be wondering, ideally you should be thinking, if a buyer is profiting off, if the buyer's profit is unlimited, loss is limited, and the seller's profit is limited and loss is unlimited from this instrument, why would someone even sell this instrument? Are you motivated to be a seller? No. That's where the seller's strategy will come in. As option seller will study the underlying instrument and understand whether this transaction or whether this option will be a in the money option or out of the money option or at the money option. He will study about the lucrativeness of the option. Based on the lucrativeness of the option, the seller will decide the premium. Obviously, if the option is very profitable to its buyer, will the seller sell it at a lesser price? No. They will charge the highest premium. If the seller is selling an option which is not so profitable to the buyer, can he charge a high price? No. Then the premium charged will be lower. So next, what we are going to go through is pricing option premium. So if the option is a profitable option, option will definitely carry a high premium. If that option is a low profitable or a loss making option, it will carry a lower premium. That is the overall understanding. That's the overall guideline. Now I am going to tell you the different situations in which this will happen. Now think about scenario 1. I am a buyer of an option. One of you is also buyer of an option. My option that I buy is an American option. Option that you buy is a European option. Now I have a longer time to execute my option. Any day until maturity I can execute. But can you do that? No. You have to wait until a particular day and execute, which can be disadvantageous. On a day where market is very high, I can buy at a very low price and get a better profit. But you can't. Why? You are going to wait until maturity date. So obviously understanding is an American option carrying a higher premium than the European option. Similarly, if an option has a greater time to expire, if it has a longer time to get expired, such options, it can be call or even put, with the time to expiry is very long. Such options will carry higher premiums. Next, your strike price. If it's a buy option or if it's a call option, you're trying to buy something, okay? And in a buying option, if the option strike price, you're trying to buy the underlying asset, okay, that's a call option. In that particular option, the strike price in which you're trying to buy that underlying asset is very high. Is it profitable to the buyer? No. But what if it's an option? It's a put option. You're going to sell that underlying asset. And in that arrangement, the strike price or the exercise price is very high, which means you can sell that underlying asset at a very high price. Then your premium or your profitability is very high. Why? You can sell it at a very high price. So higher the strike price, if your strike price is very high and that is a call option, it won't be profitable. So premium charged has to be less. But if the strike price is high and the option is a put option, highly profitable, so you will charge a higher premium. The reverse as well. If you have a lower strike price and the option is a call option, highly profitable. Why? You can buy at the lowest price. So that particular call option will have higher premium. But you have a low strike price and the option is a put option. At a very low price only you can sell. Is it profitable to you? No. Then that will carry a lower premium. Irrespective of all this, if your underlying asset is a highly volatile asset, let's take it's a share. Okay, it's a share which fluctuates daily. It can increase, decrease. The fluctuation, volatility is very high. Because of the high risk involved, obviously, the option will carry a higher premium because there is a lot of uncertainty and the seller is now obligated. So to compensate and get a better return, he will charge a higher premium. Finally, whenever it's a in the money option, it will have a higher premium. Whenever it is out of the money option, it will carry a very low premium. Okay, so that's how the premium for an option is decided. I hope that is very clear for you. Next, we have swap. So this is the final category of derivatives. I don't have again much time to get into the deliberate of this, so we'll start covering it next week. Swap is more of an exchange. That's how, so one party expects one position, they expect, let's say, interest reduction, while the other party expects the interest increase to match their risk appetite, to manage their interest rates, to manage their exchange risks. They will enter into a swap where they will exchange their cash flows. That is basically what a swap is. So we have swap, which is the final derivative for us to cover, and then cap, flow and collars to cover the interest rate risk. We are going to see what cap and flows are and what a collar is and who purchases what, who sells what. That's the important part. Okay, so with these two we should be able to finish derivative. So next week we should be able to wind up derivative and start on our next topic, which is foreign exchange market. Okay, so let's meet again next Saturday and finish off derivative and start off with forex market. Thank you so much for listening in today. We'll meet again next week. Thank you.